Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting cases of mistaken identity and buried secrets in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can. A tale where the truth arrived 5 decades too late, where a single photograph held the power to rewrite history, and where a family's desperate search ended not in reunion, but in devastating clarity. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned half a century, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and misidentification, where one woman's disappearance created a void so profound that it consumed 3 generations, and where the answer lay hidden in plain sight, filed away in a forgotten archive, waiting for someone to truly see. It was the year 1993. The Cold War had ended, the Internet was just beginning to reshape human communication, and America was entering a new era of technological possibility. But in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, one family remained trapped in the past, still searching for answers to a question that had tormented them since 1943. 50 years, an entire lifetime spent wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. The photograph that would finally provide answers had existed for 49 of those years, catalogued, filed, and overlooked in the depths of a county coroner's office. It had been seen by dozens of officials, passed through countless hands, examined and set aside, but no one had truly looked. No one had seen what was right there, frozen in black and white, until it was far too late to undo the damage that half a century of not knowing had wrought. This is the story of Catherine Brennan, a young woman who vanished without a trace in the winter of 1943. And this is the story of how she was found decades after anyone who truly loved her had given up hope of ever knowing the truth. Pennsylvania in 1943 was a state divided between worlds. In Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the war effort pulsed with industrial urgency, factories running 3 shifts, women in coveralls building bombers and tanks, the constant awareness that husbands and sons were dying in places with names most people couldn't pronounce. But in the rural stretches between these cities, in the small mining towns and farming communities that dotted the Allegheny foothills, life moved to a different rhythm. Slower, more insular, more suspicious of outsiders and change. Clearfield County occupied this forgotten landscape, a region of dense forests, abandoned coal mines, and towns where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The county seat, the town of Clearfield itself, sat along the banks of the Susquehanna River's West Branch, a waterway that had once promised prosperity through logging and now served mainly as a geographical landmark, dividing communities that might as well have existed in different centuries despite being separated by only a few miles of rough road. In winter, this landscape transformed into something almost otherworldly. Snow fell early and stayed late, accumulating in drifts that could swallow a car, isolate a farmhouse for weeks, make the simplest journey treacherous. The forests became silent mazes where familiar trails disappeared beneath white uniformity. The river froze solid enough to walk across, though everyone knew stories of those who'd tried and fallen through weak ice into water so cold it stopped your heart before you could drown. It was in this environment, harsh, beautiful, unforgiving, that Catherine Brennan lived with her family in the winter of 1943. Catherine was 23 years old that December, 23, and by the standards of her community, already becoming an old maid. Most of her childhood friends had married at 18 or 19, were already raising children, had settled into the expected pattern of rural life. But Catherine was different. She'd always been different. Tall and slender, with dark hair she wore in the practical short style that was becoming fashionable, Catherine had a restless energy that her small town couldn't contain. She'd been the first in her family to finish high school. She could have stopped there, could have accepted a position at the local 5 and dime or married any number of local boys who'd shown interest. But Catherine wanted more. She'd found work at a defense plant 40 miles away, riding a bus before dawn and returning after dark, coming home exhausted but with money in her pocket, her own money, earned by her own labor. She talked about moving to Pittsburgh after the war, maybe even Philadelphia. She talked about seeing the ocean. Her mother worried. Her father, a coal miner with lungs already showing signs of the black dust that would eventually kill him, didn't understand but respected her determination. Catherine had 2 younger siblings, a brother, Thomas, who was 17 and eager to enlist the moment he turned 18, and a sister, Margaret, just 15 and devoted to Catherine with fierce admiration younger sisters often have for accomplished older ones. Margaret would later say that Catherine represented everything she wanted to be: independent, fearless, unbound by the limitations that seemed to suffocate other women in their community. The Brennan home was a modest two-story structure on the outskirts of town, near enough to walk to the main street, but far enough that the forest pressed close on 3 sides. It was the kind of house that had been built quickly and cheaply during a mining boom 30 years earlier, with thin walls that couldn't keep out the winter cold and floors that creaked with every step, but it was home. It was theirs. On December 15, 1943, Catherine woke before dawn as usual. The house was frigid. The coal stove in the parlor had burned low overnight. She dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on the heavy trousers she wore to the factory, 2 layers of wool socks, her thick winter coat. Her lunch pail was packed with the sandwiches her mother had prepared the night before. Everything was routine. Ordinary. Margaret, sleeping in the bed they shared, stirred but didn't wake as Catherine moved quietly around the room. Later, this would haunt Margaret, that she hadn't said goodbye, hadn't watched her sister leave, had simply rolled over and drifted back into dreams while Catherine disappeared into the preed. On darkness, Catherine never made it to the bus stop. At first, no one was particularly alarmed. The bus driver noted her absence, but assumed she was ill. It happened. Her supervisor at the factory called the Brennan home that evening, and that's when the worry began to crystallize into fear. Catherine hadn't been homesick. She'd left for work at her usual time. She should have been on that bus. The route Catherine walked to reach the bus stop was just over a mile, following a dirt road that paralleled the forest's edge. It was a walk she'd made hundreds of times, in all weather, at all hours. She knew every turn, every landmark. But on this morning, somewhere between her front door and the intersection where she caught her bus, Catherine Brennan vanished. Her father organized a search party immediately. 20 men from the town, some with hunting dogs, walked the route she would have taken, then expanded outward, calling her name into the winter silence. They searched through the night, flashlights cutting weak paths through the darkness, voices growing hoarse. They found nothing. No footprints leading into the forest, though fresh snow had fallen that afternoon, which might have covered tracks. No signs of struggle. No abandoned lunch pail or any other evidence that Catherine had been on that road at all. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist somewhere between home and that bus stop, swallowed by the winter landscape without a trace. The local sheriff, a man named Harold Wickham, was out of his depth. Clearfield County rarely dealt with serious crime. Bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional theft, these were the extent of his usual responsibilities. A disappearance like this, a young woman vanishing without evidence or witnesses, was beyond anything in his experience. Still, he went through the motions. He interviewed the family, the neighbors, her co-workers. He sent inquiries to neighboring counties, asking if anyone matching Catherine's description had been seen. He filed reports with state police. And then, largely, he waited for her to turn up alive somewhere, having run off with a boyfriend perhaps, or dead, a victim of some accident that would eventually reveal itself when the spring thaw came. Days became weeks, weeks became months. The initial burst of community concern faded. People had their own problems: the war, the rationing, the constant fear that came with having sons and brothers overseas. One missing girl, tragic as it was, couldn't hold everyone's attention indefinitely. But for the Brennan family, time stopped on December 15, 1943. Catherine's mother, Helen, aged visibly in those first months. She stopped cooking meals anyone wanted to eat. She sat for hours at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. She kept Catherine's bed made, her clothes hanging in the closet, as if her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. Her father, Patrick, searched every weekend for the first year. He walked every trail in those woods, looked in every abandoned mine shaft, checked every isolated cabin. He became gaunt, obsessive. His fellow miners worried about his safety underground. A man who couldn't focus was a danger to himself and everyone around him. Thomas enlisted the day he turned 18, perhaps seeking escape from the grief that saturated their home. He would die in France 7 months later, and Helen Brennan would bury a son while still not knowing where her daughter lay. Margaret tried to hold the family together. At 15, then 16, then 17, she became the adult, cooking and cleaning and managing her parents' descent into despair. She never stopped looking for her sister. Even as years passed, even as hope became something she was almost ashamed to acknowledge, Margaret kept searching. She wrote letters to police departments across the state. She posted notices in newspapers. She traveled to Philadelphia, to Pittsburgh, to small towns hours away, following rumors that always led nowhere. A woman matching Catherine's description had been seen in Altoona, in Harrisburg, in a dozen different places that all turned out to be someone else, some other family's daughter, alive and well, and not the ghost Margaret was chasing. The not knowing was worse than grief. Grief had a shape, a beginning and an end. But this limbo of endless possibility was a special kind of torture. Was Catherine alive somewhere, unable to get home? Had she been kidnapped? Was she suffering? Was she dead? And if so, how had she died? Had she been afraid? Had she called out for them? Or had it been quick, merciful? These questions consumed Margaret. They would consume her for the next 50 years. The winter of 1943 became 1944. The war continued, life continued, but for those who loved Catherine Brennan, time had fragmented into a strange before and after, with December 15th marking the fault line between them. Sheriff Wickham's investigation, such as it was, eventually went cold. The file remained open in the technical sense. No body meant no death certificate, no official closure. But no one was actively working the case. It joined the sad collection of unsolved disappearances that accumulated in every police department, the mysteries that would likely never be solved. But something else had happened on December 15, 1943, something that wouldn't be connected to Catherine's disappearance for nearly 5 decades. 47 miles south of Clearfield, in Center County, a body had been found. A farmer named Elias Cooper was checking his fence line that same afternoon when he discovered her, a young woman lying in the shallow ditch that ran alongside Route 19, partially covered by snow. At first, he thought she might be alive, just unconscious, and he ran to her, but no, she was dead. Had been dead for some hours, he guessed, though he was no expert. Cooper flagged down a passing car and sent the driver to the nearest telephone. Within an hour, the Center County Sheriff arrived with the county coroner, a doctor named Samuel Hartley. The scene was straightforward, or appeared to be. A young woman, probably early 20s, wearing a heavy coat and practical clothing suitable for work. No visible signs of violence, no blood. Dr. Hartley's initial assessment was that she'd been struck by a vehicle. There was bruising consistent with impact, possible internal injuries. A hit and run, most likely. Someone driving too fast on the snowy road, hitting her, panicking and fleeing. The tragedy of it was compounded by the fact that no one seemed to know who she was. She carried no purse, no identification, no personal effects except the clothes she wore. Her coat had no labels. Her shoes were common work boots, sold in a dozen different stores across the state. There was nothing to indicate her name, her hometown, where she'd been going or coming from. Dr. Hartley did what he could. He took photographs, the standard procedure for unidentified bodies. He documented her appearance in meticulous detail in his report. Approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, slender build, dark brown hair cut short, brown eyes, no distinguishing marks or tattoos. Age approximately 20 to 25 years. Cause of death: traumatic injuries consistent with vehicular impact. The Center County Sheriff made the required notifications. He contacted neighboring counties, asking if anyone matching this description had been reported missing. He posted a notice in the local newspaper describing the deceased and asking anyone with information to come forward. He received 3 responses, none helpful. One was from a man whose wife had left him 2 weeks earlier, but she was blonde and 40 years old. Another was from a family whose daughter had run away to join a traveling carnival, but she was found, alive and defiant, a week later. The third was simply someone hoping for reward money who had no actual information. No one from Clearfield County saw that notice. No one made the connection. The distances between counties might as well have been oceans. Communication was slow, coordination between jurisdictions spotty at best, and there was a war on. Resources were stretched thin. People were overwhelmed. After 30 days, following protocol, the woman was buried. Center County maintained a small plot in the public cemetery for paupers and unknowns. The coroner's report was filed. The photographs were cataloged and stored. A simple marker was placed: unknown woman, died December 15, 1943. Rest in peace. The case was closed. Not solved, but closed. There was nothing more to be done. Dr. Hartley thought about her sometimes. It bothered him, the unknowing. Somewhere, he reasoned, this woman had people who loved her. A mother who'd given birth to her, held her as an infant, watched her grow. Maybe siblings, maybe a sweetheart. They didn't know she was dead. They were still looking, still hoping, still keeping a light on in the window. But he had other cases, other responsibilities. The war ended. He grew older. Eventually, he retired, and a younger doctor took over as county coroner. The files transferred, the photographs transferred. The unknown woman was forgotten. 47 miles north, Margaret Brennan never stopped searching. She married in 1952, a kind man named Robert Hughes, who understood her obsession and supported it. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Margaret named the daughter Catherine. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, as America transformed around her, Margaret's quest continued. She adapted to new technologies as they emerged. When long-distance calling became more affordable, she spent hours on the phone with police departments, hospitals, sanitariums. When photocopying became common, she made thousands of copies of Catherine's photograph. A studio portrait taken 6 months before she vanished. Catherine in a dark dress with a slight smile, eyes looking directly at the camera, and sent them everywhere she could think of. She joined early missing persons organizations. She attended conferences. She met other families trapped in the same purgatory, compared stories, shared strategies. The missing became her community, her second family. These were people who understood what civilian life couldn't, that you could function, could seem normal, could raise children and hold a job and appear to be living, while simultaneously existing in a state of suspended grief that never, ever resolved. Her parents both died without answers, her mother in 1956, her father in 1963. Both went to their graves, still keeping vigil for a daughter who would never come home. Margaret buried them with the quiet rage that comes from watching people die of heartbreak, from knowing that somewhere, somehow, there must be an answer, and simply being unable to find it. The 1970s brought new possibilities. Computers were beginning to be used for record keeping. Missing persons databases were being developed. DNA analysis was still years away from practical application, but forensic science was advancing. Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this new technology would finally provide the breakthrough she needed. She was in her 50s now, her own children grown with children of their own. Young Catherine Katie, they called her, knew the story of her namesake intimately. She'd grown up with her grandmother's obsession, had helped address envelopes and make phone calls from the time she could read and write. The search for Catherine Brennan had become a family legacy, passed from one generation to the next. But still nothing, no leads, no answers, just that same terrible silence that had persisted since December 15, 1943. The 1980s came. Margaret was 60 years old, then 65, still searching, though now her husband worried about her health. She had 3 heart attacks in the space of 5 years. Her doctor told her to reduce stress. Her family begged her to let it go, to find peace. But how could she? How could she stop when stopping felt like abandoning Catherine all over again? In 1991, a new technology emerged that would eventually change everything. The personal computer became affordable for home use, and with it came the early internet. Margaret was 70 by then, but she learned. Katie helped her navigate this new digital landscape. They discovered that old records were being digitized, that databases were being compiled, that information previously locked in filing cabinets was becoming searchable. They started making inquiries, not just to police departments now, but to historical societies, county archives, coroners' offices. They were looking for any record of unidentified women who died in Pennsylvania in the winter of 1943. There were more than Margaret had imagined, dozens. Women who died in accidents, of illness, of violence, whose names had been lost to time. Each one represented another family like hers, another void that had never been filled. Margaret documented them all, trying to determine which ones might be Catherine. It was exhausting work. Most records from the 1940s were still in paper form, not yet digitized. Tracking them down meant letters, phone calls, sometimes physical visits to dusty archives. Margaret's health was deteriorating. She knew she was running out of time. In March of 1993, Katie received a response to an inquiry they'd sent to Center County 6 months earlier. The county had hired a young clerk, fresh out of college with a degree in library science, who'd taken on the project of cataloging and digitizing old coroners' records. Her name was Jennifer Morton, and she was meticulous in a way previous clerks hadn't been. Jennifer's letter was apologetic. Yes, Center County had records of an unidentified woman who died on December 15, 1943. The coroner's report was on file, but there wasn't much information. No name, no identification. The woman had been buried in the public cemetery after 30 days, as was protocol. The case had been closed 50 years ago. However, Jennifer wrote, if they wanted to review the file personally, they were welcome to do so. All the old records were being organized in preparation for digitization. It might take some time to locate the specific file, but she'd be happy to help. Katie called her grandmother immediately. Margaret was 72 years old, recovering from her third heart attack, but there was no question. They would go, they had to go, on April 7, 1993, 50 years, 3 months, and 3 days after Catherine Brennan vanished. Margaret and Katie drove to Center County. The Center County Courthouse was a 19th-century building of gray stone, imposing and institutional. Margaret had difficulty with the stairs. Her heart couldn't handle much exertion anymore. So they took their time, Katie supporting her grandmother's arm, both women silent with anticipation and dread. Jennifer Morton met them in the records office, a basement room that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. She was young, maybe 25, with an earnest efficiency that reminded Katie of herself at that age. Jennifer had already pulled the file, had it waiting on a reading table illuminated by fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. I have to warn you, Jennifer said gently, there are photographs. They're not graphic, but they're of the deceased. If you need a moment, or if you'd prefer to look at the written report first. The photographs, Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She'd imagined this moment for 50 years. She'd prepared herself for every possibility. Please. Jennifer opened the file with careful hands. The paper was yellowed, fragile. The report was typed on an old manual typewriter. The ink faded to a ghostly gray. And clipped to the report were 3 black and white photographs preserved in protective sleeves. Jennifer removed them carefully, placed them on the table. The first photograph showed the woman as she'd been found lying in the ditch by the roadside, partially covered by snow. It was taken from several feet away, establishing the scene. You could see her form, the way she lay, but facial features were indistinct. The second photograph was closer. The woman's face, cleaned of snow and dirt, photographed in the morgue. Her eyes were closed. Her expression was peaceful. She looked like she was sleeping. Margaret made a sound, not quite a gasp, more a sharp intake of breath that caught in her throat. Her hand moved toward the photograph but stopped, hovering in the air, shaking. Gran. Katie's voice was tight with concern. But Margaret couldn't speak. She was staring at the photograph with an intensity that seemed to drain all other function from her body. Her face had gone white. Her lips were trembling. Katie looked at the photograph, looked closer, and felt her own breath stop. The woman in the photograph had dark hair, cut short, a slender face, features that were refined, almost delicate. It was hard to tell exact details from a 50-year-old photograph, hard to be certain, but the resemblance was there. Undeniable, striking. Oh my God, Katie whispered. Margaret finally found her voice. The coat, she said. What was she wearing? Jennifer consulted the report. Heavy winter coat, dark wool. Work trousers, brown. 2 layers of wool socks. Work boots. The clothing was catalogued but not preserved. There was no reason to keep it. Was there? Margaret's voice cracked. Was there anything distinctive, any marking on the clothing? Jennifer scanned the report, turned the page. There's a note here about the coat. The coroner documented that it had been repaired at the right shoulder. A patch of slightly different fabric, sewn by hand. The stitching is described as neat, but amateur. Margaret closed her eyes. Katie saw her grandmother sway and quickly pulled over a chair. Margaret sat heavily, her breathing ragged. Gran, What is it? Catherine's coat. The words came out barely above a whisper. She tore it 6 months before she disappeared, snagged it on a fence. My mother patched it. I remember watching her do it. Remember thinking she'd done such a good job you could barely see the repair unless you knew it was there. The room was absolutely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Jennifer stood frozen, beginning to understand what this meant. Katie knelt beside her grandmother's chair, one hand on Margaret's shoulder, staring at the photograph on the table. "It's her," Margaret said. "It's Catherine." Katie looked at Jennifer. "Can we verify? Is there any way to be certain?" Jennifer, to her credit, had already thought of this. "The body was buried here, in Center County. We'd need to get permission to exhume, which requires legal process, but yes, with modern DNA analysis, we could compare." She looked at Margaret. "You're her sister." Margaret nodded, still unable to look away from the photograph. "Then yes, we can verify with almost complete certainty. I'll help you start the process." The exhumation took 3 months to arrange. Legal permissions, court orders, coordination with the county, and with forensic specialists. Margaret's health worsened. The stress, her doctors said, though Margaret insisted it was just that her body knew it could finally rest, that the vigil was almost over. The DNA results came back in August of 1993. The match was definitive. The unknown woman buried for 50 years in Center County's public cemetery was Catherine Ann Brennan, who disappeared from Clearfield County on December 15, 1943. But the confirmation brought a cascade of new questions, ones that had haunted Margaret from the moment she'd seen that photograph. What had Catherine been doing in Center County? How had she gotten there? Who had hit her? And why had no one made the connection 50 years earlier? Katie, who'd inherited her grandmother's determination, began to investigate. She obtained copies of every report filed about Catherine's disappearance in Clearfield County. She got copies of every report about the unknown woman in Center County. She spread them all out on her dining room table and began to piece together what should have been obvious. The dates matched. December 15, 1943, the physical description matched: height, build, age, hair color, eye color, everything. The clothing matched work clothes, heavy coat, boots. The approximate time of death in Center County aligned with when Catherine would have been traveling to work. The answer, once Katie saw it, was blindingly obvious. Catherine hadn't been walking to her usual bus stop. She'd been offered a ride, probably by someone heading south, maybe someone from the defense plant who lived in Center County and had offered to drive her, saving her the bus fare and the long commute. It was the kind of informal arrangement that was common during the war years, when gas rationing made every ride precious. Somewhere on that 47-mile journey, something had gone wrong, an accident on an icy road. The driver, terrified of consequences, had panicked and fled, leaving Catherine by the roadside. Or maybe the driver had been injured too, had died, and Catherine's presence in the vehicle had never been known. There were a dozen possible scenarios, all tragic, none ever investigated because no one had connected the disappearance in Clearfield County with the body in Center County. But why hadn't they? That was the question that tormented Katie as much as it had tormented her grandmother. The two counties were less than 50 miles apart. The dates were identical. The descriptions matched. How had trained law enforcement officers, a trained coroner, missed something so obvious? The answer, Katie eventually understood, was systemic failure compounded by the chaos of wartime. Sheriff Wickham in Clearfield County had filed a missing persons report with state police, but the filing system in 1943 was entirely paper-based, organized by county. There was no centralized database, no easy way to reference missing persons reports from one county with unidentified bodies found in another. The sheriff in Center County had posted a newspaper notice, but only in his local paper. News didn't travel the way it would in later decades. A family in Clearfield County, 47 miles away, wouldn't have seen a notice in a Center County newspaper unless they specifically sought it out. Dr. Hartley, the coroner, had done his job correctly by the standards of the time. He'd documented everything, taken photographs, made the required notifications within his jurisdiction. But in 1943, with resources stretched thin by the war, with communication technology limited, with bureaucratic systems fragmented, the connection had simply never been made. Catherine had fallen through the cracks, not through malice or negligence exactly, but through the accumulated weight of small failures, a report not quite reaching the right desk, a notice not quite traveling far enough, a photograph filed but not widely circulated, death by bureaucracy. In September of 1993, Catherine Brennan's remains were transferred from Center County to Clearfield County. The funeral Margaret had waited 50 years to attend finally took place. Catherine was buried in the family plot, between the parents who'd died without knowing her fate and the brother who'd gone to war carrying his sister's disappearance like a wound that never healed. Margaret stood at the graveside, 72 years old and visibly dying herself, and finally said goodbye, finally released the hope that had sustained and tortured her for half a century, finally allowed herself to grieve properly now that she knew. She survived the funeral by 6 weeks. On October 28, 1993, Margaret Hughes née Brennan died quietly in her sleep, her husband at her side. Her last words to Katie had been, "She's not lost anymore, she's home." The story should have ended there. A tragic mystery solved, a family finally finding closure after 50 years. But closure, Katie was discovering, wasn't quite the comfort everyone assumed it would be. Yes, they knew now. They knew Catherine hadn't suffered for years in captivity somewhere. They knew she hadn't run away, hadn't deliberately abandoned her family. They knew she'd died quickly, probably without even knowing what was happening. That was small mercy at least, if mercy could be found in such circumstances. But the knowing brought its own particular pain, because now Katie understood with terrible clarity exactly what those 50 years had cost. Her great-grandmother Helen had died in 1956, 13 years after Catherine's disappearance. She'd spent those 13 years in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn properly because mourning required acknowledgement of death, and she had no proof her daughter was dead. She'd kept Catherine's room preserved like a shrine. She'd set a place for her at dinner on holidays. She'd refused to give away her clothes. She'd existed in a kind of purgatory, neither moving forward nor truly acknowledging the past. If someone had made the connection in 1943, if the photograph had been circulated properly, if the systems had worked as they should have, Helen could have buried her daughter, could have grieved, could have found some measure of peace in the last 13 years of her life instead of spending them in that terrible state of not knowing. Patrick Brennan had lived 20 years after his daughter vanished, 20 years of searching, of walking those woods every weekend, of investigating every rumor and following every false lead, 20 years of hope repeatedly crushed, 20 years of a life narrowed to a single obsession because the alternative, accepting that she was gone without knowing what happened, was unthinkable. If someone had made the connection, Patrick could have devoted those years to his surviving children, to his wife, to living instead of endlessly searching for the dead. Thomas had gone to war carrying his sister's disappearance like a weight. His letters home, which the family had saved, were full of references to Catherine, questions about whether there'd been any news, expressions of hope that when he came home, she'd be there. He'd died in France in 1944, never knowing. If someone had made the connection, he could have at least had the knowledge, the closure, before he went off to face his own death. And Margaret, 50 years of searching, of never giving up, of sacrificing her own peace of mind and her own health in pursuit of answers. 50 years of marriages strained, holidays ruined, money spent on phone calls and travel and copying photographs. 50 years of existing in that same purgatory her mother had inhabited, unable to fully grieve because grieving required knowing. If someone had made the connection in 1943, Margaret would have been 15 years old. She would have grieved her sister. Yes, that grief would have been terrible and real, but she would have been able to move forward. She could have had a normal life, could have pursued her own dreams instead of spending decades chasing her sister's ghost. All of this suffering, this waste of years and potential and peace, because a photograph had been filed but not truly seen, because 2 counties 47 miles apart hadn't effectively communicated, because the systems designed to connect missing persons with unidentified bodies had failed in the most fundamental way possible. Katie found herself alternating between grief and rage, grief for Catherine, for the life cut short at 23, but rage at the system, at the preventable nature of so much of her family's suffering. This wasn't like a case where someone had been murdered by a stranger who was never caught, where the failure was in the complexity of investigation. This was simpler, more frustrating. The answer had existed all along. It had just been in the wrong file, seen by the wrong eyes. She wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania State Police, detailing what had happened and suggesting reforms. The response was sympathetic, but ultimately unsatisfying. Things had improved significantly since 1943, they assured her. Computerized databases now existed. DNA analysis could identify bodies. The National Crime Information Center maintained missing persons files that were accessible across jurisdictions. This kind of oversight was much less likely now, much less likely, but not impossible. Katie kept researching and found that even in the 1990s, unidentified bodies were still being buried without thorough cross-referencing. Missing persons reports were still sometimes lost in bureaucratic mazes. Families were still waiting for answers that might be sitting in a file somewhere, unseen. She became an advocate. Had already METHOD, but with THOUGHT of modern technology. Katie began working with missing persons organizations, pushing for better database integration, for mandatory DNA collection from unidentified remains, for systems that would prevent another Catherine Brennan from vanishing into the cracks between jurisdictions. The work was frustrating and slow. Government bureaucracies moved at their own pace. Funding was always limited. There were always other priorities, but gradually things improved. Pennsylvania passed legislation requiring DNA collection from all unidentified remains. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System NAMUS was established, creating a centralized database accessible to families and law enforcement alike. Katie never knew if her advocacy made a real difference, or if these changes would have happened anyway. But she kept working, driven by the same determination that had motivated Margaret for 50 years. The difference was that Katie was working to prevent future tragedies rather than solve a past one. She often thought about Jennifer Morton, the young clerk whose meticulous cataloging had finally brought the truth to light. Jennifer hadn't done anything extraordinary. She'd simply done her job well, had cared enough to be thorough, had treated a year old cold case with the same attention she'd give to current records. If someone in 1943 had shown that same diligence, everything would have been different. But Katie tried not to dwell on the what-ifs. That way led to madness, to the same consuming obsession that had defined her grandmother's life. Instead, she focused on what could be learned, what could be changed, what meaning could be extracted from so much needless suffering. The photograph itself, the one that had finally solved the mystery, became a symbol for Katie. She kept a copy on her desk, not the morgue photograph but the studio portrait of Catherine, the one taken 6 months before she died. Catherine looking directly at the camera, that slight smile, those eyes that held intelligence and determination and hope for a future that would never arrive. Katie looked at that photograph and saw not just her great-aunt, but all the missing, all the unidentified, all the families trapped in that purgatory of not knowing. She saw the systems that failed them, and the people who worked within those systems trying to do better. She saw the thin line between a case solved and a case forgotten, between a family that finds closure and a family that spends generations searching. In 2003, on the 60th anniversary of Catherine's death, Katie organized a memorial service at the cemetery. She expected just family, but over 100 people came, members of missing persons organizations, cold case investigators, forensic specialists, advocates from across the state, people who understood what Catherine's story represented, who'd been touched by similar tragedies in their own work or their own lives. One woman approached Katie after the service, elderly and frail, supported by her daughter. "I've been looking for my sister for 40 years," she said. "Your grandmother's story gives me hope. If Margaret could find answers after 50 years, maybe I can too." Katie didn't have the heart to tell her that Margaret had only found answers because she'd never stopped looking, because she'd sacrificed her health and her peace of mind, and ultimately her life. The search, that kind of hope, came at a terrible cost. Instead, Katie took the woman's information, promised to help however she could, and added another name to the list of the missing she was trying to assist. The work never ended. There were always more cases, more families, more people trapped in that same limbo. Katie sometimes felt like she was trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon, but she kept working, because what else could she do? Stop, forget, pretend these people didn't matter. She thought often of something Margaret had said near the end. The worst part wasn't that she was dead. The worst part was not knowing, not being able to close that chapter, to say goodbye properly, to grieve and then heal. We were stuck forever in that moment she disappeared, unable to move forward. That's what I want to spare other families, not the pain of loss. That's unavoidable. Part of being human, but the pain of endless uncertainty, that's something we can prevent. And so Katie worked to prevent it, to ensure that photographs were properly circulated, that databases were maintained and cross-referenced, that no family would spend 50 years searching for answers that existed all along in a file somewhere unseen. The story of Catherine Brennan and the photograph that solved her mystery 50 years too late raises questions that extend far beyond one family's tragedy. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we build, the ways they fail, and the human cost of bureaucratic oversight. How many other Catherine Brennans are there? How many unidentified bodies lie in unmarked graves, their families still searching, still hoping, while the answers rest in file cabinets and databases, waiting for someone to make the connection? How many missing persons reports gather dust while the people they describe have already been found, documented, and buried as unknowns? The establishment of NamUs and similar databases has helped significantly. DNA technology has revolutionized identification. But gaps remain, funding is limited, resources are stretched. The same bureaucratic inertia that failed Catherine in 1943 still exists in different forms today. And beyond the practical questions lie philosophical ones. What does it mean to be truly lost? Catherine wasn't lost, her body was catalogued, photographed, documented. She was simply unidentified, which is a different kind of lost, a failure of connection rather than a failure of discovery. She was right there, in the records, waiting to be seen. There's something profoundly disturbing about that. The idea that the answer to your family's most agonizing question might already exist, filed away in some office you don't know to contact, seen by people who don't realize they're looking at the solution to someone's nightmare. It suggests a fundamental disconnect between the systems designed to help us and the people who need that help. Margaret Brennan spent 50 years of her life searching for her sister. 50 years of letters and phone calls and travel and hope and disappointment. And all along, the answer existed in a file in Center County, less than 50 miles from where Margaret lived. The distance between Margaret and the truth wasn't geographic. It was systemic, bureaucratic. A matter of information existing but not flowing to where it needed to go. This is the real horror of Catherine's story. Not that she died, death comes for everyone eventually, and Catherine's death, while tragic and premature, was at least relatively quick. The horror is in the waste of Margaret's years, of her parents' grief, of the potential her family might have realized if they hadn't been trapped in that purgatory of not knowing. There's a cruel irony in the fact that the very systems designed to help the coroner's careful documentation, the filing and preservation of records, the protocols for handling unidentified remains became the mechanisms of extended suffering. Dr. Hartley had done everything right by the standards of his time. He'd photographed Catherine, documented her appearance, made notifications within his jurisdiction, preserved the records. But without a system to connect those records to Margaret's search, all that diligence simply meant the answer was carefully preserved in the wrong place. In the decades since Catherine's identification, technology has created new possibilities for connection. Social media allows families to share information instantly across vast distances. Online databases make it possible to search millions of records in seconds. Facial recognition technology can compare photographs of missing persons with images of unidentified remains. DNA analysis can provide certainty where visual identification fails. But technology alone isn't enough. These tools only work if people use them, if funding supports them, if bureaucracies adapt to accommodate them. And there's still the human element, the Jennifer Mortons of the world, the clerks and investigators and advocates who care enough to be thorough, to look beyond the minimum requirements of their job, to see the human stories behind the files they're processing. Catherine's story is ultimately about the difference between looking and truly seeing, between processing information and making connections, between following procedure and understanding purpose. That photograph existed for 49 years before anyone truly saw it, truly recognized that the woman it depicted was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who was missed and mourned and searched for. How many other photographs sit in archives right now, waiting to be truly seen? How many other families are like Margaret's was, searching for answers that already exist somewhere, filed under the wrong name or in the wrong jurisdiction, or simply overlooked in the vast accumulation of bureaucratic data? These are uncomfortable questions because they imply responsibility. If the answers exist, if they're simply unconnected, then every day that passes without making those connections is a choice, not a deliberate choice perhaps, but a choice nonetheless. Prioritization of other concerns over the suffering of families trapped in uncertainty. Katie continues this work today, now in her 60s herself, driven by the same determination that motivated her grandmother. She's helped connect dozens of families with their missing loved ones. Some cases end with relief. A living person found, a family reunited. Others end like Catherine's, with DNA confirmation and a long, delayed funeral. But either way, they end. The purgatory of not knowing finally resolves into grief or joy, and families can finally move forward. She keeps that studio photograph of Catherine on her desk. Catherine at 23, with her whole life ahead of her, not knowing that she had only weeks left. Katie looks at that photograph and remembers that every missing person report represents a Catherine. Someone young or old, male or female, but always someone who mattered to somebody, whose absence created a void that won't be filled until answers come. The photograph that solved a 50-year-old mystery too late serves as a reminder that in our bureaucratic systems, in our databases and files and protocols, real human lives hang in the balance. That efficiency isn't just about processing paperwork quickly. It's about connecting families with answers, about ending suffering, about seeing the human beings behind the data. To this day, Center County maintains that public cemetery where Catherine spent 50 years as an unknown. Her original grave marker remains there, even though her body has been moved. A memorial not to Catherine specifically, but to all the unknowns, all those who died far from home and unidentified, who wait still for someone to make the connection, to finally see them. And on quiet nights in Clearfield County, when snow falls the way it did that December morning in 1943, people still sometimes think of Catherine Brennan. Not the mystery of her disappearance that's solved now, the question answered, but the deeper mystery remains. How many others are out there, their stories waiting in files and photographs, waiting for someone to truly see? If this journey through one family's 50-year search for truth has resonated with you, if you find yourself contemplating the ways our systems fail the people they're meant to serve, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in bureaucracy, and time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your thoughts on how we might better serve families trapped in the purgatory of not knowing. And if you have a missing loved one, if you're searching for answers, know that organizations like NAMUS exist specifically to help make these connections. The work continues, the search continues, and sometimes not always, but sometimes the answers come, even if they come too late for those who searched the longest. Until next time, remember that behind every file, every photograph, every unidentified case, there's a human being who mattered to someone. The work of truly seeing them, of making those connections, is work that can never stop.